So, is there a difference between, in your opinion, do you think there's a difference between education and learning?
Oh, big time. I think I talk about it a lot. There's a huge difference between, um, especially like I would say education and wisdom,
Mm,
or really it's knowledge and wisdom. I think best said. You can have knowledge of things, you can know about topics, but wisdom is, I think, really what determines like if you do good with that in the world,
sure.
or don't do evil with it in the world, to be honest.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things we know now. We've seen this with every like major scientific advance. Most humans are like, hey, how can we use this to make the world better? But there's always that small group that's like, how can we weaponize this? And I think we're seeing that, and in this last century with psychology and other things, like we're seeing the more we learn about humans, the larger our capabilities to bless and to hinder each other, for personal gain or like common good. And so I think like wisdom is like the most important thing.
Mm,
I think beauty and wisdom, if you can be a person that really values both of those things, you can navigate a lot of ugly, and you can also navigate a lot of complexity that knowledge itself doesn't quite get there, and so I
mm,
think learning, I feel like, is somewhere in like the middle space. And what I just talked about, where for me, in my just educational journey, I have a lot of education. It really wasn't until grad school that I really learned to love learning for its own sake,
mm,
where I figured out like, hey, achieving in this arena isn't what I'm after. What I'm learning, this was really in grad school when I was in seminary. And what I'm learning, I want to be able to bless people with. I want to be able to explain this in ways that moves and educates and blesses a community. And
mm,
so for me, like it's something flipped where all of a sudden it was like, okay, I can learn all these things, but if I learn them with the sake of for like others' benefit, including like my own even, but mostly others, it something tripped of like, okay, this is no longer just about achievement anymore, because who
mm,
cares? No one's going to ask me about my GPA from seminary. No one's going to care. What they're going to care about is, can I take these huge ideas of interpretation and mystery and all these, theology, and can I make it something that people can bring with them in a helpful way?
mm.
And I think that's, the art of teaching and wisdom creation around you. And so once I figured that out, all of a sudden it was like, okay, I just approached the whole enterprise of education from a learning side instead of an achievement side. And I think that was a major shift. I don't know if I think I couldn't oversell like how big a change that was
Sure.
in my life. It affected, we talk about lifetime learning. I think a lot of people are like, I don't get that whole idea of lifetime, because they're trained in achieve in school. And some people, it's like, well, that either makes me feel good or it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
But a love of learning, I think you really kind of have to have that switch flip. And for some people, it never happens. And some are lucky to have it happen early. For me, it was late, unfortunately, but I'm glad it did.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, when you were speaking about knowledge and wisdom, I immediately thought of knowledge is what you know, like memorizing all the facts, statistics, data that you learn. But wisdom is the application of those things,
Yeah.
and I think that's a big distinction there. And do you think learning how to learn, is that something someone, I don't want to use learn again, is that something that can be taught, or is that something that someone already has in them, like they just discover it?
I think it's a little bit of both. And I mean, I don't think we can like the value of a really great teacher. Um,
It's
man,
priceless, dude. It's
whew,
priceless.
I don't think you
Huge
could. It
difference.
just takes one or two. Like it. I mean, like we have people that teach us things,
Mm,
but then if like I think we could all point back to someone who's like, man, they just like love teaching this stuff, and
uh-huh.
I should kind of love to know it. Like there's kind of this thing that happens. I remember when I was in seminary, I took a class on education, like as
Mm,
a topic,
mm,
and they talked about learning styles. And all of a sudden, and then this teacher was really like, they rhetorically very intentional. And they said something along the lines of this, always stuck with me. If you teach only in a way that caters to your learning style, you are failing your community. And I remember it was one of those, like, they used words like that on purpose, and then they just like let the statement hang.
Yeah.
I loved it. I remember even at the moment being like, what an effective moment they just made, you know, like
Yeah.
rhetorically.
Yeah.
But then it impacted me. I'm like, man, because like here's this, group of, kind of, we're nerdy seminarians, you know what I mean? Like we're
Mm.
like all analytical types. We're all like, we want more information. We like to play with ideas. Like, just give us the data and we'll kind of like do it. Like that's what we like. And I think he was so effective in saying like, that will be the minority group when you account for everyone's learning, like just pathways in your community. And that was just so helpful for me because it really helped me break out to be like, okay, I need to tell stories. I need to use pictures. These aren't props, they're learning tools. Like it really helped me understand, like you really kind of have to hit all the different flavors to be effective.
Sure.
Especially kind of in a oratory situation. And that was really, really formative. And I think so for me, that whole story is meant to say, I think people have to kind of discover what is my way of learning. And I think once they can discover that, then they realize like, okay, now I can kind of set my learning to have that be catered to, so there's just so many options now with podcasts and everything else, and for me, I've just learned I kind of need this like balance of different sources, and I just love input, so for me, there's just like, I can just flood myself with information and I love it. And there's other people that just aren't that way, and that's not, right or wrong. You just kind of have to know, how do I like to learn, and then do it that way. And I also think too, people, they have to have something driving the passion to want to know, and whether that's personal growth, whether that's serving a community, whether that's professional advancement. I think you have to kind of know, like, why am I learning this? Like, what's my why? And some of it should just be for fun. I think you should have some things, that you ultimately aren't of much worth, and that's okay. But then there's some other things too, where I think you need to say, okay, like me knowing this impacts the environments around me.
Yeah.
Me being able to speak to what's right and what's wrong about certain things, like the impact is larger than myself. And I think that's where you have to have a little discipline sometimes, maybe a lot of courage too, to really dive in. But yeah, that's kind of my take on that.
Sure. You reading any books currently?
Yeah, I've done a lot of reading around suffrage in the last couple of years. I spent a lot of years reading a ton about race and the history of race, and I love history. I just think history is fascinating, and read a lot of books there. And then I think as you get into a topic, you could kind of put that under the topic of just like the history of liberation and oppression, depending on what way you want to look at it. And so I just realized how little I had studied about the suffrage movement. The labor movement's kind of on my next, leg of the journey here. I also read a ton about personal development, and more just like adult development from a psychological perspective. I think psychology is maybe one of the most important sciences right now, and just the amount of gained knowledge in the last 20, 30 years in that field, like, is absolutely incredible. Sure. And, and I just think knowing kind of how humans develop and the stages we tend to go through. And I think it's been just helpful to me, navigating a season where I feel like I've grown quite a bit from one season into another. The predictability of it is nice to know. And then you can kind of navigate, I think, with maybe a little bit less bumps and a little bit feeling a little more seen in that process, so I find it affirming. So that's been something I've been reading a ton lately. But yeah, I like to read the hard stuff. I've done a decent amount of reading about fascism and totalitarianism in the last year or two. A lot of podcasts on that. Tim Snyder and others. Yeah. And my wife will often ask me, she's like, man, you read like heavy stuff, it's like, and it's like, I'm the person that just says like, we can't look away, and knowing what's going on and having a sense of like when it's happened before and how it looked, and just for me feeling like, I just, yeah, to me as like a reformer, I think you just have to have that view of history, that because it could really help you understand, and sometimes just remind you that you're not crazy, that the things that you're seeing have happened before in
Hmm.
different forms, and here you are, right? So I love history. I also find a lot of inspiration from history.
Sure.
There's people who did exquisitely brave things that kind of knowing those stories, you can kind of grab like those moments where you're just like feeling kind of exhausted or down, or feeling like, wow, the systems that have made this other thing happen are huge
Hmm.
and seemingly unconquerable.
Hmm.
You look back at history and pretty easily find people that said, yeah, I feel all the same ways, but they did it anyway and it worked, and there's um, I find a lot of inspiration there. So that's why I read a ton of history for that purpose.
Yeah, lots of virtuous people back in the day.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think there's virtuous people. That's the thing I always remind myself. It's like, we don't know even the people themselves. Like Ida B. Wells, I don't think had a sense that like she would be someone with streets named after her.
Uh-huh.
Like that the tide of moral opinion would change so swiftly uh, and so thoroughly that she'd be as celebrated as she is. I
Hmm.
mean, she did writing about lynching as a Black woman anywhere in the US in the time that she lived, where basically racial terror was tolerated
Hmm.
by most of the systems that she existed adjacent to or within. Like, incredible,
Hmm.
absolutely incredible. And so so I look around and there was there's people right now that like don't know that's who they are. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
we'll get 80 years down the line and I think be surprised by some of the folks that were like, yeah, we didn't really understand what we had and that person, growing up,
Hmm.
they were pretty amazing when you just step back and look at all their life. um, and so yeah, I take a lot of heart in that we just like we kind of don't know the heroes we're walking amongst right now. You really don't know, and there's also people that it could very much go the other way,
Yeah.
and they tend to not know themselves either, maybe even to a greater degree,
Yeah.
and that should give us all pause. So yeah, it's yeah, history's wild. You just never know what's going to happen, and
Hmm.
I think that's why it's exciting.
Sure. Who was it that said this? That history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme.
Yes.
I forget who said that, but definitely I think maybe perhaps we're seeing that now. We're seeing
Hmm.
it rhyme right now without
Yes.
even knowing it.
Yes.
So
Yeah. Yes. I think that's the right way to put it. Because just so many things are different and they
hmm.
change. Yeah, I think rhyme's the right metaphor because yeah, you could look back at history and say, okay, these seem to be the teams, this seems to be the ideologies that supported each side. Here's the assumptions that were going on, but like the general, I mean, just the technology, especially as you study the last 200 years. I
Hmm.
mean, just think of like the cataclysmic change in technology, even in the last 100.
Absolutely.
Since the printing press, it's just been this nonstop technological explosion that has affected every phase, right? Every stanza, if you will, to stick with the metaphor.
Hmm.
But I believe there are certainly parallels that go on these like century cycles, and you know that certainly informs how I interpret where we are right now.
Sure.
Absolutely, but
Sure.
it's different every time.
Yeah.
So you can't necessarily rest on your laurels that the solutions are going to be the same or
Yeah.
that the ball is going to bounce the same way. You just can't because it's so different.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, if you study history really hard or thoroughly, I should say, it does seem like you can kind of predict where certain movements are going to go once they get started and get a little steam.
Hmm.
So fortunately, yeah, we might get into it, but that gives me. I think we're in for some speed bumps here as a society in the short term.
Sure. Sure.